good. So I'd like to introduce the panel quickly. We have David, Brad, and Rob. David is a partner with IE Law. A lot of experience in licensing, both on the licensee and licensor side. So we should get some interesting perspectives there. Brad is with Flashman Studios, really at the coalface of it, working directly with licensors, building games, and has worked with incredible brands like Star Wars, Marvel, Walking Dead, Family Guy, Simpsons, South Park, many, many others. And Rob is EVP of Corporate Development and General Counsel at Jam City. You work with, we work with, you've got Family Guy, and you've got some very, very interesting licenses. So it's a pretty interesting lineup here. My own experience in this is the very first game deal I did with my very first company was to license the mobile rights for Frogger from Konami it was in 2001. People said, "What? Hey, you want to make a cell phone game?" And we did very, very well out of that. And I got the license bug then. My current company, Touch Press, makes and publishes educational games for young kids right through the middle school. A lot of IP, including Justice League, Power Rangers, things like Eric Carl's Very Hungry Caterpillar. We haven't announced it yet, but we've just signed Peanuts as well, which I think you guys also have a Peanuts license. So a lot of familiarity across licenses here, and one of the things we will actually be talking about, I think at some point, is over-licensing or over-licensed properties and how you assess it. But I'm going to kick off with Brad, if you don't mind, Brad. Just want to have a quick chat because, as the CEO of a developer and publisher, really you're setting the strategic direction for your company, and you're making the decisions about why you've gone with licensing or not. So why should a developer consider licensing in IP? Or what was your decision point?
I think for us, we've done a number of original IP games ourselves and with our clients. And original IP is great. You should always have original IP in your lineup, I think. But if you're doing mobile games, it's purely user acquisition play to license, obviously. So when I think about, we licensed the Olympics both for Sochi and Rio, and around the Olympics, a ton of games come out, track and field games, and just every possible kind of game. But if you want to get promotion by the stores and you want that authenticity, having the official license for the Rio Olympics, for example, doing a game around that makes a lot of sense. So if you don't have a huge war chest for user acquisition like the big publishers do, chance of getting promoted by Apple for an original IP game, of course it happens, but it's a bit of a crapshoot. So I think it's a very reliable way to do a user acquisition play and run a business case against that as well. It's very hard, I find, to do a business case around original IP, to do forecasts and so on. So,
are you using, probably maybe it's the same consideration for most developers. For us, very hard to acquire users in the kids space. However, vast amounts of organic search and organic installs on IP. Are you then leveraging those users to sell your original IP?
Well, I think Rob might speak better to that. We do cross-market, but unless you have a pretty big portfolio and you have to look at cannibalization and target demographic, and there's so many factors that go into that. I think if you're a bigger publisher and you have a larger portfolio, it can make sense. I mean, if you're an EA and you spend $5 on user acquisition, you bring them into the network, that can make sense. If you're a small developer and you spend $5, you got a lot of pressure to monetize with that, to make that $5 back with a smaller number of games.
So, Rob, you have actually a pretty good range of original IP as well as licensed IP, so I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yes, thank you. Jam City is in a fortunate position to be able to analyze both the original content games against the IP-based games. And actually, we got our start with original content, and we were fortunate enough that our founders made the move to mobile off web-based games fairly early in the process. And so it's a really good point about cross-promoting games. What we try to do is to segment our users and try not to over cross promote, because you, even in our case with such a large universe, you still can affect the dynamics of a game. We also find that a lot of our players who enjoy, and we're in the casual match 3 puzzle space as far as our original IP is concerned, and in that space, the subcategories of a match 3 versus a bubble shooter, they don't necessarily cross over, so we have to be careful that we don't distract them. But going back to just the question of why original IP or why licensed IP, I think that was absolutely correct. User acquisition is one of the big things that we look at. The other thing also is, I think going to more of a root-based analysis is you have to have a good game. So I would like to point out that if you do not have a good game and you get a good license or a great licensor, that does not assure you success, and vice versa. Sometimes if you have a really good game, a great game, you can have success without IP. But I think trying to cut through the noise on the platforms is going to be a big challenge to have them feature you, where Apple is a bit of a mystery and they never let you know what's going on. We find that working with our partners at Google, they're a little bit more transparent in how the decision's made or whether we can expect something. So, but it's always worth a shot to make your great game first.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I've been involved in a number of projects over the years where we talk about reskinning in a while, and just what a bad decision that can be. Yeah, I mean, it's just because it's great IP doesn't automatically make it a great game. David, we've talked about the perspective from developers and publishers. You work a lot with licensors in this space. What are the licensor motivations in your view?
Well, it sort of depends, but most of it is brand extension. If you're taking a license to a motion picture, it's the movie company gets additional dollars spent on advertising that they don't have to spend themselves, and it's a lot of brand extension. They're also looking for partners that can execute on a good game and deliver on the users. Depending on the size of the licensor, smaller developers are at a disadvantage to compete for those kinds of projects.
So it's funny. So in nobody's case, nobody said the motivations are money. So we're talking ultimately, we're building businesses here. Ultimately, we hope that it'll translate into profit, but primarily on the licensing side, or on the licensor side, it's about brand extension, and hence
let me be clear, the money is great, and if you're taking a license to a huge property, you're going to pay large guarantees and you're going to pay high royalties. If you take a license to a professional league or a professional sport, you're going to be paying players' associations and the league, and you're going to have to make advertising commitments and whatnot. So yeah, the money is important as well as the brand extension, but ultimately the brand extension is what would make the deciding factor for a company to choose company A or company B to take that game to market.
Interesting segue into the economic structure of licensing deals, and I think there's a misconception that you're a small company, maybe fewer than 10 developers, maybe in some cases fewer than 5, or maybe you're a larger company. That there's a misconception that licenses are big money, cost a lot. And I think it would be very, very useful, if you don't mind, Rob, just talking about what the components of a sort of a typical licensing deal are from an economic perspective.
That's a really good point. I will say that having now looked at a ton of licensing deals for our company, the components are generally some form of guaranteed money, which then you're able to recoup against some royalties that you pay. Those are the two big pillars, and then you can kind of dig a little bit deeper, and you can kind of decide if you want to pay those royalties at the gross level, at the net level. Usually, most people understand that you have to pay a platform fee, and they're okay with it happening afterwards. I also want to point out that on games where we have licensed games, for example, Peanuts, or we have Family Guy, Futurama. In those cases where a game is solely based on the IP, those costs are going to be a bit higher. However, in some of our games, we have also licensed IP for particular events to give the game a boost. And so if you have an original IP game that you want to do an event for, and I'll use an example, we had a Scooby-Doo event in our Panda Pop game that was around Halloween. Sometimes the licensors they don't expect a huge amount of that minimum guarantee payment. And that's one of those areas where you can benefit from the IP for a short blast of users, some featuring on the platforms, and it's something to look into where the upfront cost isn't as high, or the entry point isn't as high. Again, it's not a full game, it's more of an event or some sort of marketing event that you do within the game. But that's something to also look at.
I think it's important to note that licensors do not allow licensees to recoup development costs. So, if it's development cost of manufacturing, they'll allow a platform fee. They'll allow possibly some other incidentals, taxes, and banking charges maybe. But if you're looking to recoup,
how about marketing?
Nope. They'll have a marketing commitment, but it's not a recoupable expense.
I can tell you that I have seen lately some deals where the trend is to allow for user acquisition costs to be taken out, where really what you're saying to the licensor is we're both committed to this, and we're both going to go in there as partners, and we as the publisher of the game are going to front some of this activity, and we're going to go out there and do our best because that's what we know what to do, but we should share that as partners. And we've seen that that licensors are starting to accept that. So it's something worth asking for. Again, if you're doing a full game, but if you're doing kind of one of these licensed event-based, you're correct. That's a one-off. It's a short-term thing.
Brad, your own experiences?
Yeah, we're also seeing that. I mean, if you're talking about a console game, premium game versus a mobile free-to-play game, obviously they're very different business cases. And what we found is you have a partner, as you just mentioned. You got a partner as a licensor, and their goal is to extend their brand, as you said, protect their brand, and to make money. And so we've also experienced some user acquisition partnerships, if you want to call it that, for some of our games. But I think the other key point is you can be really creative. There's no set model for licensing IP. There really isn't. I mean, we've licensed IP, big IP, like can't probably name, but big IP for no advance, no MG, but a really high rev share, and it was worth it to us. You can play with the amount of money you're paying before you launch, the advance versus the MG afterwards. You can do escalating royalties once you hit certain targets. And so we found that, I think we'll talk about this a little later, but build a business case. Don't just show up and say, hey, yeah, I want that IP and I got a great game. You have to build a business case and present that, because usually, in all cases, your pitch is going in front of somebody who's looking at a spreadsheet. So run spreadsheets, run business cases, show them. And it also tells you as a developer, is this even viable economically? Because I think just putting down a $100,000, $200,000 check doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make that back. So you can be really creative with licensing. There's lots of different ways to cut deals, basically.
I want to talk about that in a moment. I want to talk about also trying not to lose the run of yourself because you love a particular license. And whether the market loves it or not is a different question. So we've talked about the structure of deals, but let's talk brass tacks. What are royalty ranges that anybody in this audience should be expected to pay for, let's say some of the sort of IPs we have here without naming anything, let's say Justice League or Peanuts or, well, not Star Wars, that's a unique case, but what sort of numbers should they expect to be paying? Not in upfront, but what are royalty rate ranges in your experience? I mean, in my case, I'll just say as little as we can get away with. But what does that translate to in terms of percentages?
Well, anywhere from 10 to 50%. I mean, if you're
10 to 15?
Yeah, 10 to 50.
Yeah, 50.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes
I've been doing very generous deals there.
Yeah, well, there's again, I guess we can't really mention the brands, but there's one fairly well-known licensor that they want no money down, but they want 50%.
Yeah, I've had that experience. And actually, we have done at least one deal with a 50%, but typically we try to get to under about 25.
I mean, the way it works is the higher the advance in MG, typically you can negotiate on the back end, but you again can get into trouble with a free-to-play game because if you have too much royalty on the back end on a free-to-play game and you've got ongoing costs, at a certain point, like with the Smurfs, we acquired the Smurfs from Beeline. It's a game that's been out for 5 years on mobile. At a certain point, you can't pay those high royalties because you're continuing to invest in the content every month, and you need to go to the licensor and say, hey, look, as a business case, I can't make money anymore paying this. So there's negotiation along the way, too. But that's our experience.
Yeah, I think the range is broad enough where I don't think any of us will get in trouble with our licensors. But yes, 10 to 50% is right. I think other factors to also consider is whether that's before user acquisition or after user acquisition. And that is another lever that you can pull along with the amount of the MG. And, you know, we've seen, I think for us, we've seen some deals where there's co-publishing deals too.
I'm going to mention this.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, okay. Very, very interested because they damn well sure recoup their development costs in co-publishing deals.
Yeah. So it's actually it's an interesting model where, but I think licensors are moving away from it. But it was a model where the developer could recoup in whatever the partnership amount was set up, their development costs. And so either on a monthly or quarterly basis, you would submit a bill for the other person's share of the development costs, and those would be paid back. And then everything was whatever the percentage is. Let's just say 50-50. The downside for a developer is that you become, to some extent, a work-for-hire type. It's a work-for-hire type situation. You're not the publisher, and you're not in control as much in the destiny of your game. On the other hand, it is a lower cost way and de-risking way to work with a good licensor, and number two, to get yourself out there. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that we as Jam City at this point in our company's life to do something like that, but I would say it's not something to poo-poo if it does present itself to you.
Yeah, it can be I think probably every developer does one, and then hopefully realizes that it probably wasn't the best thing to do, but it gives them a lot of experience working with a licensed content. David, I'm really interested in the concept of co-publishing. There's no such thing as co-publishing, unless you're setting up a joint venture legal entity and pushing it out. Is that right, would you say? Somebody's the publisher of record. Somebody is ultimately...
Well, somebody is the publisher in the mobile space. Yeah. Somebody is the publisher of record. And, the Apple and Google monitor that carefully. And, the publisher of record is the one that controls the users, controls all of the saved player save rewards and whatever they build up in terms of their in-app purchases and whatnot. So the other side of that, if the deal terminates, it's hard to take a game and take it from one publisher to another publisher on the mobile space and retain your users. But a lot of licensors will contribute to development costs, as Rob said, and they want to be a co-publisher. And some licensors, some of the larger film studios that don't have game companies, their agreement will say co-publishing and licensing agreement, even though your licensee is the publisher of record. So some of it is just the notion of I have publisher next to my name.
Yeah. So before we talk about working with some of the licensors, and it can be a bit of a minefield at times, what constitutes a good license? I mean, is it just on the basis of the forecast that you put together, or how do you go about identifying a license that you want to acquire, and then how do you go about getting the license that you would acquire? I mean, think back to your first licensing deals. I'd love to hear your experiences there, both Brad and Rob.
Well, so I was not around when Jam City did its first licensing deal, but the story behind it is...
What was that, by the way?
Oh,
okay.
I'm going to get to it. It's a good story, which is we were approached, back then our company was called SGN, we were approached by Fox to do a game for the movie Book of Life, which was an animated movie. And we had not We had not done licensing like that before, and we didn't have a lot of time to develop the game. So we did take IP, create art, and put it on top of the mechanics of an existing game. I will say that that was the beginning of a very good, lucrative relationship with Fox. We have since done, we have 2 Family Guy licenses with them, and 3 actually with Futurama as well. And it turns out that until today, that game has actually generated more revenue for Fox than the film actually did. Wow. And we were very fortunate because of our ability to work with a great outside. We had to outsource some of the artwork because we didn't have enough time to do it in-house. But it's been a very successful relationship. I will say something that the folks did with on this game that we wouldn't do, what we wouldn't do this time around, is they didn't do a lot of consumer research. They just kind of went with the opportunity. It was an opportunity. They felt it was low risk, high reward, and they went for it. But today, we, and not to be, to toot our own horn, but if there's an IP we want to do a game with, we can go and get it. Because we've established ourselves as a company, with a good track record. However, with that also comes the danger of just loving an IP. Like, oh, this would kill, Of course you got to put Star Wars in this, or you have to put, Spider-Man in this game. Well, it turns out that we have a fairly robust consumer insights group now, and we actually do a fair bit of testing before we sign these deals, because there's such big deals now, and the licensors are expecting more and more money as far as the size of the deal. I mean, the budgets for these games are approaching movies to some extent, small movies. And so we have to be really careful that we don't get into a situation where we signed a license that sounded good in theory, even with the art looked great and we mocked it up, but then when you present it to our consumer panel, they may say, oh, no, I would never click on that. I wouldn't search for that in the App Store.
There was an instance back in the bad old days of Java games. Just when Java games, the bubble was about to burst, or the iPhone was about to burst the Java game bubble. And I remember the name of the company. They're long gone. The big news at GDC was that they'd secured the mobile rights for the Da Vinci Code for $1 million for mobile Java game rights. Thinking, well, this is a license that's been acquired purely to appease your investors or to make it look like you're making the transition from original to licensed IP. The game was never made. The company was out of business a year later. You really have to be very careful with your IP selection. Brad, I'd love to hear about your experiences in that regard.
Well, you just reminded me back in early J2Me and Brew days. I think the first licensing deal I did personally, we represented, I can probably say, CBS Sportsline at the time, who was the biggest and maybe still the biggest fantasy sports player. And that was a 7-figure check we got from Nokia to do a golf game and a fantasy sports game around it. I have no idea. I think back to that now, it's just crazy. But I think that what I picked up from what Rob said is so true, whether you're a big company like Jam City or a smaller developer, is you got to do your homework. You got to do as I mentioned earlier, you got to put that business case together. You got to put the spreadsheets together. And you have to have credibility too. We talked about this earlier. If you're just a 4-person developer, which is fantastic, but you have no games, don't go knocking on a studio's door. They're not going to talk to you. You have to build credibility. So when I think about when we worked with Zen Studios for over a decade, and on the digital pinball side, we did all the licensing, Family Guy and Star Wars and all of that. We initially thought, hey, let's just go and talk to Star Wars and make a great pinball game. But then we backed up and said, no, we have to build credibility first. Launch some original IP games. We started with some smaller IPs. We actually started with like Street Fighter and some smaller brands. And then we could show the quality of our work. And we could then run the business case and say, well, we launched Street Fighter on these platforms. How much money did it make? What's the real business case here? Then we went. And so it took some patience, I think, to be able to do that, but it eventually paid off doing that initial work. So even if you're a small developer, you can do that, I think, effectively as long as you go through the right steps. So
yeah, I'd like to revisit that in a moment. But David, I'd like to hear, you've probably done some diligence for publishers looking at developers, and what are not publishers, but licensors looking at developers. What are the sort of no-nos for a licensor who is thinking about working with a smaller company?
Well, again, I think you have to look at who's the licensor and what kind of license are you bidding for. If you're talking to one of the major licensing companies, a major studio, a sports league, you're going to get an application that's longer than applying for a mortgage. They're going to want banking references, credit references. They're going to want to know your top customers. They're going to want to know a whole bunch of, in the mobile space, your ARPDAO and all of your user statistics and whatnot. They're going to want to know all that stuff. And if you don't have any of that, then you better have a very good game that lends itself to the licensed property and catches the attention of the licensor development person to say, yeah, this game fits Star Wars, or this game fits Family Guy, or this game fits a particular property, and it makes it a natural fit, and that would allow a developer with a little track record to get access to some licenses. They may not get the license, but the licensor may say, we like this game, and go to a publisher and say, we've identified a developer that's got a great game. If you could do a deal with them, we'll give you the license to our property. Oftentimes, publishers will look for developers first and then pitch that to a licensor. It used to be the other way around. The publishers would get the licenses from the studios, and then they go a frantic search for a developer to meet a marketing date.
And there's more than one route to a license as well. What we found in Touch Press and its predecessor, Story Toys, is often there's a consumer products group that may have certain rights, digital rights, that you can push to, as long as you're not necessarily conflicting with the core game rights, that you can secure very, very high-profile IP. And in our case, as I won't name the IP because I'm certainly under NDA, I think we paid a low five-figure minimum guarantee, 25% royalty for a major IP that has just done significantly more than that for us. So, don't just assume that you have to go to the games guy. There are other licensing groups within large organizations that often can license interactive rights, not necessarily game rights, but interactive rights, which can be stretched into the concept of that you're effectively making a game. Okay, I want to move on to talk about, I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, managing and working with licensors. One other last thing. And this has been a big one for us, territory rights. Often we've gone to licensors and they've said, you can have everything, but you can't have Japan. Or you can have everything, but you can't have LATAM. What are your views on that? Will you take a license that's US only?
I think US only, if the IP is predominantly a US brand, I would.
Yeah.
But if it's a more global brand, I think that would be too limiting. But we in fact, do have licenses that exclude particular geos. And for very specific reasons that once you dig in, the licensor explains it to you, and it's this complicated thing. And we're usually patient enough to say, what we do is we option that territory, that if for whatever reason what's holding the licensor back from allowing you to be in that territory, once that falls away, we've got first rights to that. That's kind of how you could protect yourself. But it's okay. Nowadays, the licensors understand that with mobile games, this is a global play.
Yeah.
It also needs to be a global play for us if we're going to invest the money in making the game and paying the MG and doing the user acquisition. We would love to be able to go out to the entire world and try to have this game be popular for everyone. That actually is one of the deciding factors when we choose IP, is can we go global with it, or is this limited to North America or just LATAM? And so that is one of the considerations we take in.
Brad, similar?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, console versus mobile. Console, if you're licensing for console, maybe PC, you don't need Asia typically, but yeah, the amount of money the licensors want and the commitment on your part, it has to be worldwide in our experience.
The flip side of that, though, is if you get a global territory, the license will require you to release the game around the world.
Absolutely.
And if it's a use it or lose it system, and that doesn't work around the world. So you argue, okay, we'll release the game in major territories by the marketing date, which is the launch date, and the smarter companies, seeing that China's different, will exclude China. And
sub-licensing rights in that case are very, very important.
Yes.
We can talk about, again, working with licensors, what should and should not be in the agreements. But if you're going for something global and you think it's great because this is a huge IP in China, but you have absolutely no experience doing anything in China whatsoever, and it is very, very difficult when it comes to a content space, make sure that you have the right to at least sub-license in those territories that you can't execute optimally in. Right, working with them. I've had some interesting experiences, and I would say that it always takes longer than you think to work with the licensor, particularly on approvals, overheads. I think could be a significant factor to project quality. And Brad, I said I'd ask you this. You had some interesting insights when we had a call about the other day, just about specifically managing licensors. So you want to give your perspective?
Yeah, I think I really see it. There's sort of pre-deal and post-deal, like production, and you really have to manage expectations going into any deal and understand what the licensor's motivations are, what you're hoping to execute and deliver on. And as you said, you need to understand, okay, it says 15-day approval clause here, but how long does it actually take you to approve something? So when we work with the Smurfs, any of the big licensors, they have well-oiled machines for approvals. They're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of licensees. And you can be assured that there's an approval process that's pretty well streamlined. Smaller IP, 15 days could mean 45 days. And if you're trying to hit a game deadline, it can be a real problem. And I think also we talked a little bit about approval rights. So the big brands are going to approve pretty much everything, but there's a certain point where there's gameplay, and who has approval rights on gameplay. If you want to add, like I think about the Smurfs, if we want to add a gotcha mechanic in the game, they're going to say, yeah, that's a gameplay item and it doesn't affect our universe and our brand. You do what's best, but as soon as we start, you want to kill a Smurf in the game, that's going to be a problem. So I think setting expectations is important, and tons of communication. You just can't show up the day before you're submitting something and just submit it and hope for the best, so, yeah.
It works the other way as well. What you have is sometimes, the day before you're about to submit, you've just said everything and it's popped up to some EVP or up to the CEO. The CEO thinks, wouldn't it be great to get this in there? How long will it take? And you realize it's a 6-month process to change the game. So you have to be I find aggressive would not be the right word, but really, really firm with licensors. And often, I think probably in your first deal and your first license, you make a lot of mistakes and acquiesce on too many points. But you get to a point where you just say, look, this is the way that it has to be, and these are the firm dates. And if you can get any sort of deemed approval after certain windows, it's key. They don't like that, right?
If you're looking for a license from a professional sports league, a film studio, a television production company, there will be no deemed approvals.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. And the contract will
I have one license with deemed approval.
The contract will say, we'll use our best efforts to get back to you in 10 days, but if we don't, it's deemed disapproved. And you have to trust them, because if you're a first-time licensee, it's shocking. And as a lawyer, I have to tell them, look, this is the way it is. Here's how you manage the process. And if you understand how the approvals process works, it becomes less of an issue, but it's a shocking thing. You mean they could disapprove it and I'll never get my game out? Yep.
Yes, that is the short answer. I have been able to convince some licensors to, it's more a feel-good language to put in the contract, where if after a certain time it says, if after 10 business days we haven't gotten back to you, it's deemed disapproved, Well, I've been able to get language in that said, well, at that point it triggers kind of this good faith, you got to get on the phone and people have to talk to each other so that there isn't just silence where they're not even obligated to get on the phone. So I've been able to get that in, and that works pretty well. But I will say, as an attorney myself who reviews these contracts, but also as someone who manages the relationships with these folks, you can't paper every scenario. You can't put in there every single thing that's going to come up. And most of it, it's like a normal relationship with any other professional or even in your personal life. There's give and takes, and you have to be able to compromise. I'll give you one good story. Everything got approved. We put something in a game. It went live. And it turns out that someone at the licensor realized that something that we were featuring had been litigated before. And our licensor had settled a lawsuit against this particular piece of IP, and they completely missed it. And now we're live with this. And they're like, you have to take it down, which is a big deal for us to take something down after we've published a game. So you can either take the position of, hey, too bad, you approved it, and we're leaving it up, and if we get sued, you've already indemnified us, so we'll see you there. Or, which that's not the position you took. The position you take is, okay, we got you, we understand, and they admitted it was their mess up. So you just have to be flexible about these things. You cannot just look at the contract all the time and say, well, in the contract it says this, especially in something as complicated as intellectual property, and especially IP that's very mature, like the Smurfs, for example, that has 30, 40 years of IP in there, and there's going to be a lot of things to think about.
If you find yourself back to the contract a lot, then you have problems.
I think you have to be careful because, and a lot of times when I'm on the licensee side, I'll make sure that the licensor understands that you can't make it's nimble changes in the computer world are not possible, and you try and structure the approvals so that it's harder for them to disapprove something the further along the way the production line you got. Because if you get to beta and that's your only approval and the licensor disapproves it, you're screwed. You have to really manage expectations. You also have to understand if the licensor has experience in reviewing games and approving games, and if they all suddenly say, "Oh, this is cool, let's add this or let's add that," and you have to, you've lost the race.
I'm curious. I was actually going to come back to you, David. Like, when you're working for a licensee, what other things are you telling the licensee to watch out for?
Well, you have to be careful about what you're licensing.
I got a good story on that in a moment.
The definition of the licensed property is very important. If you're licensing a film, if you're licensing the rights to make a film, and the film is based on a comic book character, does the comic book company get to make a game while you're making a game based on the movie? What happens if the comic book character and the character in the film look exactly alike? Sony and Marvel were in a huge litigation many years ago over Spider-Man, because Spider-Man in the movie looked like Spider-Man in the comic. And how do you distinguish an action figure from DC or Marvel Comics from Sony consumer products? So that's one problem. If you're looking at licensing games, make games based on films, you don't get actors' licenses. You don't get the right to use material from the film. That's all separate. So you really have to understand what it is you're getting, and does that meet your expectations?
I think that's absolutely critical. And I cast my mind back to it was 2008, and I'd inherited, I think I just joined Bandai Namco, and I'd inherited, well out of my 5-year confidentiality post-leaving window, I'd inherited the license for both X Factor and Idols. Could come in, deal had been done before, and I looked at this license, and it was not cheap. We didn't have the music, which was absolutely critical. We didn't have Simon Cowell, absolutely critical. We didn't have any judge rights. All we had was the ability to use the name, and we had to then decide whether we wanted to spend a lot of money for Simon's Face, which we said no. Do sound alikes on the sound, or licensing the original music, which would have added another 50% to the license cost. Not getting those details right, not really understanding what you can and can't do, is absolutely critical at the start. And, I think, for smaller developers, the idea of getting a deal sheet together first, which actually outlines specifically what you're doing, that everybody signs off on that before you get into contracts, I think is very important, because you can find yourself quite far down the road and then discover you've got this major problem because the theme tune isn't available to you.
One of my clients released this goes back to the console days, released a game featuring Aerosmith that had no Aerosmith music in it.
Yeah, we've been doing some licensing in the music business too, and everybody talks to KISS, but we were doing something with KISS, and then we found out that they don't own the rights to a lot of their music. And so we had to go and see, could we get it redone? And, it's KISS, but it's not KISS. I mean, yeah, you got it. But the company we're talking to was perfectly willing to license us the likeness rights, and, you got to do your homework.
And our fun story is that if you download our Peanuts game, Snoopy Pop, we got the rights to Peanuts and then went to someone else to get the rights for the music that everyone knows. But we didn't get the rights to the recordings on purpose. And somebody who works for me at the office, who's a pretty good pianist, he recorded it all. And so he was very happy to put that into the game. So all the music you hear is actually one of our employees playing the music. But yeah, you have to make sure no one wanted that game without the music. It was important enough where we went and licensed it, just because it was important.
And you need to understand that there's two licenses for music.
Right. Yep.
There's the license from the music publisher, and if you want to use a particular master recording, you have to go to the record company and get a separate license to use the recording. So in his case, re-recording is common.
And I can tell you from just doing a deal perspective, if you go and license a big IP, and I'm thinking about Star Wars that we licensed, and same situation, you have to go to another company or two to get the music. You better not do the deal and then go to those guys and say, hey, I just did a deal, I need the music, because then they just start, rubbing their hands and go, yes. So we learned, if you're dealing with music, talk to those guys simultaneously and say, we're about to do this deal, and work with the licensor to get that, or else you'll probably add an extra zero to your number.
Music can be a nasty gotcha in a particular if you're dealing with the television or movie license. Other nasty gotchas that I've had to deal with over my time with licensing agreements are change of control provisions. If you have any desire to sell your company at some point in the future, you want to look at this very closely. Can you explain that a little bit?
Most licenses are what the lawyers say non-assignable, which means if Rob's company gets a license, they can't assign it to another party without the consent of the licensor. They also would deem any sort of financing transaction, any sort of merger or acquisition transaction as that results in a change of control as tantamount to an assignment. And if they're doing a deal with the licensee and their management, and down the road that management changes, the licensor is rightfully concerned. They don't know who that is. Some licensors use that opportunity to negotiate what they call a transfer fee. In other words, we'll consent to your change of control, but now you pay us a non-recoupable fee for that.
It's one of the things, if you were working with a lot of licenses and having just gone through a change of control with my own company, it's not something you want to leave till the last minute. You want to have all of your licensors lined up, understanding what this means for their business, understanding how a change of control will improve their position, and make sure that you have all of those letters, because these are material agreements. If you are doing an exit or any sort of M&A activity, significantly material agreements. So get it done well ahead and don't be scrambling around at the end. And I did with my first company exit. We didn't even look at it until I think probably 3 days before we were due to close. It's difficult.
That leads me to say that if you're thinking of buying someone who's got licenses,
yes,
go there first. Make sure you know what you're buying. Just because they've got 2 or 3 games in the top 50 in the app stores and you think you're just going to slide in, definitely double check those. But if you do proper due diligence and you have a data room, nowadays that should pop up right away. And I also want to say that I think part of it is establishing a good relationship with your licensor. A lot of them are willing to put language in there where they need to be notified they can okay it, and they won't unreasonably withhold that okay, as long as you have a relationship where they know you or the buyer. One of the reasons they put that in too is they don't want a competitor of theirs to come in and buy you, and then all of a sudden, Marvel owns the rights to a DC comic mobile game. So that's why they put that in there. But for the most part, I'm starting to see that they're realizing that there's a lot of activity in our space, especially in the mobile publishing space. So they don't want to completely cut themselves off.
I want to leave some time for questions for the audience, but I do have one, kind of getting to the natural conclusion. Licenses generally have an end date. And what happens at the end?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. You have to plan for success, and typically a licensor is going to want to do as short a term as possible. Within limits, and you want to have as long a term as possible to monetize, the economics of the deal. But I think to protect yourself, wherever possible, it's perfectly fine to put things in the agreement to say, look, it's a 3-year deal, but if I hit this number by such and such a date, guess what? The deal automatically extends by a year. Those, again, going back to the creative aspect, you don't just have to sign a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal. In mobile, it's very hard to do a deal beyond 3 years. But you also have to think about, okay, I'm playing on a 12-month development cycle, whether it takes 18 months and I get a 3-year deal. Now all of a sudden I've got 18 months to monetize my game. So we try to think beyond, we try to think as long as possible within reason to grab those rights, because when it comes time to renegotiate, you've got a good game, you're over a barrel in terms of negotiation. So. Yeah.
Plus, the point about licenses ending, for a company that makes its reputation, a game company that makes its reputation on licensed properties, those licenses end, and all the goodwill that is generated under those licenses goes to the licensor, not to the licensee. The video game business is littered with companies that bet big on licenses or aren't in the business any longer. THQ being one.
Yeah.
Acclaim had a wrestling license, which they lost, and that cost the company dearly. So licensing is a risky strategy if that's your entire portfolio.
One more thing I would say is to the point of making sure that you have the term of the agreement start from when you launch is something that you can ask for so that you do get the full amount of time. I'm starting to see now sunsetting language also, which basically says, which is kind of the corollary to, if we're succeeding, this deal will continue for another set period of time, and then we're going to look back again, and if it's succeeding, you get another year, and you could do that for a few years, and usually the licensor is okay with that because you set the success dollar amount at a high enough level where it's worth it for them. Why would they go and try to bid it out if they're making money? And then the sunsetting is, you definitely want to make sure that you figure out a way that when the license ends, that you don't just shut it off. We all know that you don't just turn it off, and there are these users, and if you have in-app purchases, so there needs to be a sunsetting time period to make sure that there's a smooth transition away once the license does end.
Okay, great. So I think we've covered the life cycle from acquisition to negotiation to launch, running, and then an end of a license. Do we have some questions from the audience at this point?
Thank you all for your insights. My name is Isom Winton from CyberZ Japan. And I was wondering, considering a geo like Japan where the users are very unique and the revenue potential is pretty high, how much attention is paid to localizing the UI UX or the monetization scheme, considering a popular, largely American IP that you're going to launch globally? Thank you.
Well, not to show off, but we actually have a Japanese national who heads our localization just for Japan. So we take the geos very seriously. Japan for our company is probably number 2 or 3 geo after North America versus English-speaking Europe. I think it's, again, it's a business, and so you have to look at the business case of it. If you're, depending on how much revenue you're generating and the potential market for the type of games. So for us, the casual puzzle kind of cute game type scenario, it really works well in Japan. But we don't, for example, invest as much into our type of casual puzzle games, for example, in Korea, because that's not a popular market for our type of games. So it really just becomes a business investment. And we have folks like this for France, for Germany, Japan, and Latin America as well.
I think there's a mindset, especially with American companies, to just throw an English version out everywhere and hope it works. But certainly, I used to live in Japan. I know, like, even having lived in Japan, like, we're not as big as GMC. We work with local partners that really know what to do on the ground. And we know how important localization is in Japan. I mean, it's huge, and the right kind of localization. So China, Japan, geos like that, I mean, unless you're big, you need local partners to guide you, for sure.
It's it does bring a whole separate, different set of overheads and approvals, and maybe different music that needs to be licensed, maybe different character voices you need to work with. So it can get complex, particularly in markets that are, let's say, more difficult for Western companies to navigate.
I just also had, like, the Smurfs movie came out. We have the Smurfs game, and we had to work with LaFig, the licensor, to look at their launch schedule for the movie worldwide, because it wasn't just one launch date. I think Japan was 6 or 9 months later. Korea was 7 months later. So we had to carefully look at every single geo and work with them to understand what kind of marketing were they doing, when was the movie launching, and how do we piggyback on that and work together. So.
Another question?
Yeah, I guess so. I very much understand that for some things you would need content approval, and if you're potentially killing off characters in a universe that doesn't embrace death, that's going to be a major issue. But how much, as a licensee, should you expect from the licensor, kind of at the beginning of the relationship, in terms of content guidelines? So for Spider-Man, you may have thousands of pages of canon that you don't want to mess with, and what is the expectation to you from them for what they'll provide you in terms of sort of a playbook for the characters?
Well, I think if you're talking about licensing a property like Star Wars or Star Trek, there's the prime directive, and you can't make a game that violates the Star Trek universe. Star Wars has a similar kind of, you can't, it's like you don't cross the streams kind of thing, and don't introduce a Star Trek concept into a Star Wars game, and vice versa. If I'm looking at a license, and it's based on content, you have to translate and adapt their content into your game. Do they have a style guide? Do they have approved images? Some licensors will say you need to go to our company that does animation in order to get the same quality of animation that's in the film or in the television show. So you have to do your homework to say, all right, I'm adapting Star Wars. What kind of assets am I getting, and what kind of reference material am I getting that I know will be approved as long as I execute on that? And if there's little stuff available, then I think that's a big challenge for the licensee.
I would echo that. That's exactly right. It really depends on the game, especially in some types of games where the content updates are basically using the art or whatever the IP is, and just kind of, let's say the underlying issue is match 3, for us, and we don't run afoul of kind of the storylines if we were to do, like Family Guy, for example, which we do have a Family Guy puzzle game. So we're able to kind of keep making new levels and things like that. But at the beginning, everything has to be figured out at the beginning, as much as you can. So this goes back to get the style guide, work with the folks, and start showing them kind of the ideas and testing. I don't think any of our, and I'm looking at it now, all of our IP has very strict guidelines on the art, the story, and what can happen to those characters. In fact, when I was talking earlier about bringing, for example, Scooby-Doo into our Panda Pop game, that's okay. The Warner Brothers says that's fine, and we're good with it. But I cannot bring Scooby-Doo, even for a week, and have him appear in my Snoopy Pop game. Because you can't have two characters from different worlds all of a sudden see each other because they're not related and it's not okay. You can't do fan fiction type stuff where the universes somehow meet. So you have to be really careful about that.
Hi there, Nick from Amazon. Digging deeper into the point around understanding the value of a license, what's reasonable to ask from a licensor to understand the strength of the license and how it might fit with your product? Have you got some good questions to ask? And do licensors tend to understand the audience customer in the same way or as well as many successful game studios do?
Not sure I understand your question. Say it.
Well, I guess if I'm a developer who's interested in working with a license, what are the sorts of questions that I would want to ask that licensor to understand the value that license would bring to my product? Obviously, if I'm expected to pay an MG or a licensing fee or a rev share, how do I quantify that in a meaningful way?
Well, I don't know of a major media company that will answer that question. If you're going for a popular property, they assume you already have done some market research and know that that lends itself to your product. I do think you want to ask questions and due diligence about what materials are available, what the approval process is, how do you work, what are your expectations of a licensee, so that, because those are the things that may or may not make it into the contract. I think those are the questions you're going to ask. But if you're pitching for a World Cup license, you already know the brand appeal of the World Cup. So you want to know what's FIFA going to do to support you and help you get your game out on time.
I have some other questions you could also ask. So nowadays, lately, I've been noticing that we've been getting nice decks, even from something as, I'll use Peanuts because everyone knows we're working with them, but when you talk to Peanuts, we were able to ask, so who do you appeal to? Tell me a little about, give me the history. We got to go up to Charles Schultz's ranch and meet his wife, and we got to see kind of the family, and you go through the museum, and you really get a sense of what's going on with them. I think another good question to ask is, what other games are you doing for that license, and when are they launching?
Yep.
Because you want to make sure, and we forgot to kind of mention this in earlier, is you got to make sure that even though they're whining and dining you, that they're not whining and dining for other gaming companies for, oh, you're doing puzzle, but we sold Bubble Shooter to this guy and Match 3 to that guy. So you want to make sure that you get a clear understanding of that. And I think nowadays these licensors have a whole group of folks who are there to sell their license. And they're going to try to sell you. I've had phone calls from major sports leagues who are pitching as hard as anyone for us to take a look at their IP, and they're doing a good job.
Yeah, that's an important point about what is their licensing strategy. So if you look at something like Warhammer, their licensing strategies put a lot of games out there. Hello Kitty, a lot of stuff. Fox, not so much. A game every couple of years maybe. And you really have to understand that. For the Olympics, when we did the Sochi game, we had an exclusive. We assumed and had an exclusive on the Rio game. It's an exclusive in the sports category. We didn't know they were going to do some casual games, like a runner game for the Olympics. I mean, it was so out of the blue, and suddenly there was 4 or 5 games out there, which certainly cannibalized our game, but, that was our bad. We had an exclusive, but didn't dig a little deeper. But I think the biggest thing to ask, depending on the brand, is what marketing support are you going to get? Because a lot of the media companies will not put anything, like if you look at a Family Guy or something, you may assume you're getting some TV exposure. Probably not going to happen. And they'll usually nudge, wink, wink. No, we'll get you some stuff. We'll get you on our Facebook page and so on. So I would ask the question, what specific marketing things are you going to do for my game? Because I categorize brands in 2 ways. An evergreen brand, like a Star Wars or James Bond. People know the brand, they're just going to get it and buy it. But if it's an up-and-coming brand, you really need that marketing support. If they have 100 million people on their Facebook page, okay, tell me, are you going to promote us every content update every month? Are you going to do some contests? Like, what are you specifically going to do? Because if it's not in the contract, you really have to discuss that and what the expectations are, because you can get let down. Because there's other people running those departments that may not want to promote, or you're competing with a ton of other licensees for that particular brand as well.
And if you're doing a license that's tied to the release, let's say, of a motion picture, you want to ask how certain is the company that they're going to meet their release date, because you're gearing everything to hit a certain launch date, and if the movie gets delayed, that certainly changes the dynamic of the license.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to the panel. I think we've got some great insights there. I'm sure if there's any other questions afterwards, we're mingling out that. So thanks again.
Thanks. Round of applause,
Thank you.
everyone.